He thought he was renting paradise for his mistress. He didn't realize he was paying his wife to watch his world collapse. Before we continue this thrilling story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, like this video and comment where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more powerful stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's get into the story. Clifton Riley's reflection dominated the floor-to-ceiling glass of his corner office, 43 stories above Manhattan's beating heart. At 42, he was everything success looked like. Silver hair swept back with mathematical precision, shoulders that filled his charcoal Tom Ford suit like armor, and eyes that held the cold confidence of a man who'd never met a deal he couldn't close or a woman he couldn't charm. The city sprawled beneath him in geometric perfection, each building another conquest in his personal empire. His latest acquisition, a biotech startup he'd gutted and rebuilt, had netted him $12 million in 6 months. The check was already deposited, already earning interest in accounts scattered across 3 countries. Money was just points on a scoreboard now, and Clifton Riley was winning. His phone buzzed against the mahogany desk. Elizabeth's name appeared on the screen with a photo he'd taken years ago. Her laughing at some charity gala, champagne flute raised, pearls catching the ballroom light. She looked radiant, untouchable, like something carved from ivory and good breeding. "Darling," her voice floated through the speaker. Cultured and warm. "The car will pick you up at 7 for the museum benefit. Don't forget your speech notes are in your jacket pocket." Clifton barely listened. Elizabeth managed their social calendar with the efficiency of a Swiss timepiece. Charity boards, museum galas, dinner parties where Manhattan's elite gathered to congratulate themselves on their benevolence. She was perfect at it, gliding through their world with quiet grace, never raising her voice, never making demands. To him, she was wallpaper. Beautiful, expensive wallpaper that came with the house. "Actually, something's come up," he said, his lie already polished to perfection. "Emergency board meeting. The Singapore acquisition needs immediate attention. I'll have to fly out tonight." A pause. Not surprise. Elizabeth never questioned his business, but the slight recalibration of a woman rearranging her evening around his absence. "Of course. I'll make your apologies to the committee. How long will you be gone?" 3 days. Maybe 4. "I'll have Henderson pack your bag." The blue suits. Perfect. The word tasted like victory. "You're an angel, Elizabeth." He ended the call and immediately dialed another number, one that made his pulse quicken. "Riley Capital, this is Vera." Even her voice was different from Elizabeth's. Younger, hungrier, with an edge that suggested she knew exactly what she wanted and how to get it. Vera Germany had walked into his office 6 months ago as a junior analyst, all honey blonde ambition and scarlet lipstick, and within a week, she'd become his most intoxicating addiction. "Conference room 3. Now," he said, ending the call. She appeared moments later, closing the door behind her with deliberate care. Today she wore crimson, a dress that hugged every curve and made her look like sin wrapped in designer silk. Where Elizabeth was classical music, Vera was jazz, unpredictable and electric. "Is it ready?" she asked, perching on the edge of his desk, close enough that he could smell her perfume, expensive and complex. Clifton reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a set of keys attached to a platinum keychain. The metal caught the afternoon light, throwing prismatic reflections across the walls. "The Palisade Estate," he said, watching her eyes widen. "Penthouse level. 38th floor." Vera's fingers traced the keys like they were made of diamonds. "Clifton, that building is legendary. How did you?" "Money talks, darling. Especially when it speaks with the right accent." He stood, moving behind her, his hands settling on her shoulders. 3 days. No phones, no interruptions, no world except what we make between those walls. She leaned back against him, and he felt that familiar rush of power, the intoxicating blend of possession and transgression. This wasn't just an affair, it was conquest. He was taking the most beautiful woman he'd ever known to the most exclusive address in the city, and doing it right under his wife's unsuspecting nose. "What about Elizabeth?" Vera asked, though her tone suggested the question was formality rather than concern. "Elizabeth thinks I'm in Singapore, reviewing merger documents in boardrooms that smell like leather and old money." She'll spend the weekend planning her next charity auction or selecting flowers for the conservatory. Her world is. He paused, searching for the right word, contained. It was true. Elizabeth lived in the elaborate cage he'd built around their marriage. Social obligations, household management, philanthropic duties, all funded by his generosity, all designed to keep her occupied and out of his way. She had her committees and her causes, her garden parties and her book clubs. She didn't ask about his business trips because she didn't need to. Trust was a luxury only the wealthy could afford, and Elizabeth had never had reason to doubt him. The black Aston Martin purred through Manhattan traffic like a predator stalking prey. Vera sat beside him, her hand resting on his thigh, her excitement palpable. The Palisade estate rose before them like a glass cathedral, its facade reflecting the dying sun in sheets of gold and amber. "It's beautiful," Vera breathed, and Clifton felt another surge of satisfaction. This was what power looked like, the ability to provide experiences that left people breathless, to open doors that stayed locked for everyone else. The valet took the car with the reverence reserved for objects worth more than most people's homes. The lobby enveloped them in understated luxury. Marble floors polished to mirror brightness, fresh orchids that probably cost more than his secretary's monthly salary, and the kind of hushed acoustics that whispered of serious money. The elevator was a work of art in itself, all brass and mahogany with buttons that felt substantial beneath his fingers. As they ascended, Clifton watched the floor numbers climb and felt his anticipation build. This was his kingdom, his rules, his perfect crime. The doors opened onto paradise. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around the space like a jeweler's display case, offering 360-degree views of the city that never slept. Champagne waited in a silver bucket, condensation beating on the bottle like diamonds. Fresh roses, white ones, Elizabeth's favorite, though he didn't think about that, filled crystal vases throughout the space. "It's ours," he whispered, handing Vera the keys, watching her face light up with the kind of joy that money could buy but never quite duplicate. "No one will ever know." Vera spun in a slow circle, her dress flaring around her legs, her laughter echoing off the glass walls. She moved to the terrace doors, throwing them open to let in the cool evening air. The city sprawled below them, a carpet of lights and possibilities. Clifton joined her at the railing, pulling her close, breathing in the scent of her hair and the night air and the intoxicating perfume of his own audacity. This was what winning felt like, standing above the world with the most beautiful woman in the city, completely untouchable, completely free. Only as the last rays of sunlight struck the terrace glass, 3 silver letters gleamed with subtle elegance in the lower corner, etched so seamlessly into the surface they might have been shadows. E.R. Estates. Clifton's eyes passed over them without recognition. His attention focused entirely on the woman in his arms and the city at his feet. He didn't notice the monogram, didn't wonder what it meant, didn't realize he was standing in the heart of an empire that had been watching him long before he'd ever dreamed of betrayal. The trap was perfect. The prey had arrived. And somewhere in the city below, Elizabeth Riley was finishing her evening tea and preparing to show her husband exactly whose kingdom he'd chosen to desecrate. Morning light flooded the penthouse like liquid gold, transforming the glass walls into a kaleidoscope of reflected sky and steel. Clifton Riley stood shirtless on the wraparound terrace, his chest still bearing the faint marks of Vera's fingernails from the night before. The city spread beneath him like a conquered territory, and he felt every inch the victorious general surveying his spoils. Espresso steamed in his hand, real espresso, not the pretentious foam art Elizabeth preferred at her charity brunches. This was how mornings should be, simple, honest, uncomplicated by obligations or expectations. Just him, the woman he wanted, and the world bending to his will. "You look pleased with yourself," Vera called from the bedroom, her voice carrying that morning rasp that made his pulse quicken. She emerged wearing nothing but his white dress shirt, the fabric hanging loose on her smaller frame, the collar open just enough to remind him why he'd risked everything for this. "I should be," he said, pulling her against him, feeling the warmth of her skin through the thin cotton. "Look at this view. Look at this place. This is what happens when you know how to make things happen." Vera nestled into his embrace, her fingers tracing the muscles of his chest. "Tell me again how you pulled this off." The waiting list for this building is supposed to be years long. Clifton's grin widened. This was his favorite part, the retelling, the demonstration of his power. One phone call. That's all it took. I called the leasing office, mentioned Riley Capital was looking for executive housing for our overseas clients. Implied we might need multiple units long-term. He gestured expansively at the penthouse surrounding them. Within an hour, they were offering me the crown jewel. Just like that. Money talks. Darling. But smart money. Money that knows how to speak the right language. That screams. He kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of expensive shampoo and satisfied woman. This is what I do. I see what I want, I figure out the angle, and I take it. Vera laughed, that bright sound that made him feel younger than his 42 years. She pulled away, padding barefoot across the marble floor to where a glossy brochure lay scattered among the champagne glasses and rose petals from the night before. The Palisade Estate, she read aloud, settling into the leather sectional, the morning light making her hair look like spun gold. Premier luxury residences in the heart of Manhattan's architectural district. She flipped through pages of artistic photography. Infinity pools, private wine cellars, rooftop gardens. God, Clifton, this place is unreal. Only the best for you, he said, joining her on the couch, his hand finding the smooth skin of her thigh beneath his shirt. Vera continued reading, her expression shifting from admiration to curiosity. Listen to this. The Palisade Estate, a flagship property of the Riley Group, represents the pinnacle of contemporary luxury living. She looked up at him, eyebrows raised. Riley Group. Same last name as yours, babe. For a split second, something cold touched Clifton's spine. But the feeling passed so quickly he almost convinced himself he'd imagined it. He laughed, the sound easy and dismissive. Coincidence. Riley's not exactly an uncommon name, sweetheart. Probably some Irish real estate family from Boston. Old money, no imagination. He took the brochure from her hands, barely glancing at the cover before tossing it aside. Besides, if I owned a building like this, don't you think I'd have mentioned it? Vera giggled, apparently satisfied with the explanation. She curled against him, her head on his shoulder, and Clifton felt his world settle back into its perfect axis. This was his reality. Luxury, beautiful women, and the intoxicating knowledge that he could have anything he wanted. They spent the morning in bed, ordering room service that arrived on silver trays, making love with the kind of abandon that only came from stolen time. By noon, Clifton felt invincible again, any momentary unease forgotten in the haze of satisfaction and champagne. It was when they were preparing to leave for lunch that the universe decided to remind him how quickly confidence could crumble. The concierge desk in the lobby was staffed by a distinguished man with silver hair and the kind of posture that spoke of military training. He looked up as Clifton and Vera approached, his face lighting up with the practiced warmth of someone accustomed to serving the wealthy. "Ah, Mr. Riley," the man said, rising from his chair with deferential grace. "What a pleasure to see you again. I trust everything with the Penthouse is to your satisfaction." "Absolutely," Clifton replied, his chest swelling with pride. This was how it should be, recognition, respect, the acknowledgement of his status. But then the concierge continued, his voice carrying the easy familiarity of someone sharing insider information. "Mrs. Riley spoke so highly of your taste in architecture during our last conversation. She mentioned you'd appreciate the attention to detail in the crown molding and the imported Italian fixtures. Quite the eye for quality, she said." The words hit Clifton like ice water. His smile faltered, freezing halfway between confidence and confusion. Mrs. Riley? The only Mrs. Riley in his life was Elizabeth, and Elizabeth had never set foot in this building. Elizabeth didn't even know this building existed. "I'm sorry," Clifton said, his voice careful, controlled. "I think there's been some confusion. What Mrs. Riley are you referring to?" The concierge's eyebrows lifted slightly, as if the question itself was puzzling. "Why, your wife, of course. Mrs. Elizabeth Riley. Lovely woman, very gracious. She was here just last week for the quarterly property review." The lobby seemed to tilt. Clifton felt Vera's hand tighten on his arm, felt the marble floor shift beneath his feet like the deck of a ship in rough waters. His mind raced, grasping for explanations that made sense, for logical reasons why his wife's name would be connected to this place. Must be another Riley, he said, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. Common mistake. Different family entirely. The concierge looked uncertain now, as if he'd committed some social error he couldn't identify. Of course, sir. My apologies for any confusion. But as Clifton walked toward the exit, Vera silent beside him, he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The building that had felt like his kingdom an hour ago now seemed to watch him with different eyes. The marble floors that had reflected his triumph now seemed to echo with whispers he couldn't quite hear. For the first time in 20 years, Clifton Riley felt a tremor beneath his throne. And in the back of his mind, 3 silver letters began to glow with uncomfortable clarity. E.R. Estates. The silence in the Bentley was deafening. Clifton stared out the window as Manhattan blurred past, his mind replaying the concierge's words like a broken record. Mrs. Elizabeth Riley spoke so highly of your taste in architecture. The phrase felt like a splinter lodged in his brain, impossible to ignore, impossible to extract. Vera sat beside him, her earlier excitement replaced by uncertainty. She'd tried twice to start a conversation, but Clifton's responses had been monosyllabic, distracted. Now she simply watched the city pass, her fingers fidgeting with the designer purse he'd bought her last month. It's nothing, Clifton said suddenly, more to himself than to her. Just a coincidence. Elizabeth's never even heard of the Palisade estate. But even as he said it, something cold was settling in his stomach. 15 blocks away, Elizabeth Riley stood before the floor-length mirror in her penthouse dressing room, adjusting the lapels of her pristine white Chanel suit. The fabric was severe, architectural, more armor than fashion. Her dark hair was swept into a perfect chignon, every strand precisely placed, and her makeup was flawless in its restraint. She looked like what she was, a woman who commanded boardrooms and bent million-dollar deals to her will. Mrs. Riley. Her assistant, Margaret, appeared in the doorway with an iPad and the kind of efficient urgency that had made her indispensable. The car will be here in 20 minutes for the Whitney benefit. Thank you, Margaret. Elizabeth's voice was silk over steel, cultured, controlled, revealing nothing. She reached for her pearl earrings, each one worth more than most people's cars. Before I forget, what's on tomorrow's schedule? Margaret consulted her screen. Morning yoga at 7, then the Palisade Estate quarterly review at 10. Lunch with the museum board at 1, and the evening is free unless you'd like me to. Palisade, Elizabeth interrupted, her fingers pausing on the second earring. The word hung in the air like a musical note, beautiful and sharp. Remind me, the penthouse unit that just leased last month. Do we have the details on that contract? Margaret's fingers danced across the iPad. Yes, ma'am. Unit 38A, the Crown Penthouse. 12-month lease at $45,000 monthly. Signed. She paused, double-checking the information, 3 days ago. And the lessee? It's interesting, actually. The contract was signed by Clifton Riley, through his private investment firm, CR Holdings. Margaret looked up, her expression carefully neutral. Same last name as yours, ma'am. Quite the coincidence. Elizabeth's reflection stared back at her from the mirror, perfectly composed, giving nothing away. But inside, something crystalline and cold was forming, like ice gathering at the edges of a winter pond. She set down her wine glass with the precise control of a surgeon placing a scalpel. Interesting, she said softly, her voice carrying no more emotion than if Margaret had announced the weather. Very interesting indeed. Margaret waited, sensing the shift in atmosphere but uncertain of its meaning. Elizabeth Riley was a master of composure, a woman who could negotiate billion-dollar mergers without raising her voice or revealing a flicker of emotion. But 20 years of working for her had taught Margaret to recognize the subtle signs, the way Elizabeth's posture became fractionally more rigid, the way her fingers stilled completely, the way the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Ma'am, is there anything? Pull the complete file, Elizabeth said, turning from the mirror. The application, the financial verification, the lease agreement. Everything. I want it on my desk first thing tomorrow morning. Of course. Is there a problem with the tenant? Elizabeth moved to the window, gazing out at the city that sparkled like a jeweled crown beneath the evening sky. Somewhere out there, her husband was playing his little games, spinning his careful lies, believing himself untouchable. The irony was almost artistic in its perfection. No problem at all, Margaret. Simply due diligence. Her smile was glacier thin. After all, we must ensure our most exclusive property is being used appropriately. At the Palisade estate, Clifton had regained his swagger. The afternoon champagne had helped, as had Vera's enthusiastic response to the emerald bracelet he'd surprised her with at Tiffany. Whatever momentary confusion had occurred in the lobby was forgotten, relegated to the category of minor administrative errors that meant nothing to men of his stature. I have an idea, he said, pulling Vera closer as they stood on the penthouse terrace. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that made the city look like something from a movie. Tomorrow night. A proper celebration. What kind of celebration? Vera asked, her new bracelet catching the light as she traced patterns on his chest. Here. On the rooftop. Private dinner, champagne, just us and the stars. His grin was pure predator, all teeth and confidence. I want to show you what it really means to own the sky. Vera's eyes lit up with delight. Clifton, that sounds perfect. But won't it be expensive? I mean, arranging something like that on such short notice. Money is no object when you know the right people, he said, kissing her deeply. I'll call the building management tomorrow, arrange everything. Catered dinner, string quartet, the works. We'll drink champagne while the city bows at our feet. He felt invincible again, master of his universe. The momentary unease from earlier seemed laughable now. So what if there was another Riley with property investments? So what if some concierge had gotten his wires crossed? Clifton Riley made his own luck, bent reality to his will, and tomorrow night he would prove it all over again. Far below, in her penthouse across the city, Elizabeth Riley finished her wine and prepared for an evening of smiling at donors and making small talk about art acquisitions. But her mind was already on tomorrow morning, on the file that would be waiting on her desk, on the conversation she would need to have with her building manager about their newest tenant. She had built an empire on patience, on gathering information, on waiting for exactly the right moment to act. 20 years of marriage had taught her that Clifton believed he was smarter than everyone else in the room. It had also taught her that he was usually wrong. Tomorrow, she would remind him exactly whose kingdom he'd chosen to desecrate. The Queen was about to reclaim her castle. Mr. Riley. About your rooftop reservation request. I've spoken with ownership, and they're very interested in meeting with you personally to discuss the arrangement. Clifton's grip tightened on the phone. Meeting? That's not necessary. I'm happy to pay whatever premium you require. I'm afraid the owner insists, sir. She's quite particular about the use of the rooftop facilities. Could you come down this afternoon? Say 3 o'clock. The word she hit Clifton like a cold draft, but he pushed the discomfort aside. Property management was full of demanding women with too much authority and not enough perspective. He'd handled worse. Fine. 3 o'clock. The Palisade Estates management office occupied the entire second floor, a shrine to understated luxury with Persian rugs, mahogany paneling, and the kind of artwork that whispered rather than screamed about money. Clifton adjusted his tie as he entered, his confidence returning with each step across the marble floor. The building manager, a distinguished man in his 50s with silver hair and military bearing, rose from behind an imposing desk. Mr. Riley, thank you for coming. Please have a seat. Clifton settled into the leather chair, crossing his legs with practiced ease. This was his natural habitat. Expensive offices, important conversations, the subtle dance of power and money. About the rooftop event. Actually, sir, I wanted to discuss extending your current lease first. The manager opened a thick folder, revealing documents that made Clifton's monthly payments look like pocket change. The owner was quite pleased to have you back in one of her properties. Something cold touched Clifton's spine. Back. The manager's smile was perfectly professional, giving nothing away. Perhaps I misspoke. But she did mention this wasn't your first experience with premium real estate. Clifton forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow even to his own ears. And who exactly is this mysterious owner? I like to know who I'm doing business with. Oh, it's no mystery at all, sir. The manager's smile widened, and Clifton had the sudden, unsettling feeling that he was the only one not in on some cosmic joke. Mrs. Elizabeth Riley. Lovely woman. Very hands-on with her properties. The words detonated in Clifton's chest like a depth charge. Mrs. Elizabeth Riley. His Elizabeth. His quiet, predictable wife who spent her days arranging flowers and planning charity events. His Elizabeth who supposedly knew nothing about business beyond writing checks to museums and hospitals. The room tilted. Clifton felt his carefully constructed world shifting beneath him like sand, each grain of certainty tumbling away into an abyss he couldn't see the bottom of. Riley, he repeated, his voice sounding strange and distant. That's quite a coincidence. Coincidence, sir? Clifton's mind raced, grasping for explanations that made sense, for logical reasons why his wife's name would be connected to the most exclusive building in Manhattan. Distant relative, he said quickly, the lie tumbling out before he could stop it. Very distant. Different branch of the family entirely. We don't really keep in touch. The manager nodded politely, but something in his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Of course, sir. In any case, she's very pleased with how you're enjoying the property. The phrase hung in the air like a noose. Clifton felt sweat gathering at his collar, felt his perfectly pressed shirt beginning to stick to his skin. He needed to get out of this office, needed air, needed space to think. The lease extension, he said, his voice carefully controlled. Let's handle that quickly. I have another appointment. The manager produced the documents with efficient speed, and Clifton signed them without reading, his normally precise signature wavering slightly. All he could think about was escape, about putting distance between himself and the growing certainty that his perfect crime was unraveling. Wonderful, the manager said, collecting the papers. I'll let Mrs. Riley know everything is in order. The elevator seemed to move in slow motion. Clifton stood frozen, watching the floor numbers descend, his reflection staring back at him from the polished brass doors. He looked pale, shaken, like a man who'd just seen his own ghost. The lobby blurred past. The doorman's greeting sounded muffled, distant. Clifton's feet moved automatically toward the exit, toward his car, toward something that resembled safety. Inside the Bentley, he gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The leather seats that had felt like luxury an hour ago now seemed to trap him, suffocate him. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. Riley Capital Management, this is David. David, this is Clifton Riley. I need you to pull the file on CR Holdings real estate lease. The Palisade Estate. I need to know who processed the paperwork, who approved it, everything. A pause. Sir, I'll need to check with the senior partners. That information is typically. Now, David. This is urgent. I'll see what I can do, sir. Can I call you back? The line went dead, leaving Clifton alone with the sound of his own thundering heartbeat. His phone buzzed again. Vera's name on the screen, her photo smiling up at him with the kind of innocence he'd spent 6 months corrupting. Hey, baby, he answered, forcing his voice into something that resembled normalcy. How's your day? Perfect, now that I'm talking to you. Are we still on for tonight? I was thinking we could order from that Italian place you love. Actually, Clifton said, his mind spinning through possibilities, contingencies, damage control. Let's keep things low-key for a while. Just until this Singapore deal closes. Low-key. Clifton, what's wrong? You sound. Nothing's wrong, he lied, the words tasting like ash. Everything's fine, babe. We just need to be smart about this. Careful. But even as he said it, one thought hammered through his skull with the persistence of a funeral bell. She knows. Somewhere in the city, Elizabeth was moving pieces on a chessboard he'd never even realized existed. And Clifton Riley, master of the universe, king of his own destiny, was beginning to understand that he'd been playing the wrong game all along. The grandfather clock in the Riley mansion's foyer chimed midnight, its bronze notes echoing through rooms that had witnessed 15 years of carefully orchestrated lies. Clifton stood at the bottom of the marble staircase, listening to the house settle around him, waiting for the sound he needed most: silence. Elizabeth had retired 2 hours ago, disappearing into their master suite with the same quiet grace she brought to everything else. He'd heard the distant sound of running water, the soft click of her bedroom door, and then nothing. The house had exhaled into stillness, leaving him alone with his spiraling thoughts and the growing certainty that his world was collapsing in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. He'd spent the evening in his study, downing Macallan 25 and staring at his phone, waiting for David to call back with answers about the Palisade lease. The call never came. Neither did sleep, nor peace, nor any of the things that used to come easily to men who owned the world. Now, standing in the darkness of his own home, Clifton felt like a stranger. Every shadow seemed to watch him, every creak of the old house sounded like an accusation. But he needed answers, and there was only one place left to look: Elizabeth's study. The door was unlocked. It always was. Elizabeth had no secrets, or so he'd believed for 15 years. The room beyond was exactly as she'd left it: immaculate, organized, a monument to the kind of quiet efficiency that had made their social life run like clockwork. Her desk was positioned to catch the morning light, its surface clear except for a single Mont Blanc pen, a crystal paperweight, and her laptop. The laptop was closed but glowing faintly at the edges, indicating it was merely sleeping rather than shut down. Clifton's hand shook as he opened it, the screen flickering to life with a soft chime that sounded like thunder in the midnight quiet. No password. Elizabeth had never needed one. Who would dare violate her privacy? The desktop was as organized as everything else in her life. Folders with names like museum board, charity events, and household management. Normal things. Predictable things. The digital equivalent of the quiet, contained world he'd built around her. But there, nestled between garden club minutes and wine collection inventory, was a folder that made Clifton's blood turn to ice. Palisade Estate Holdings. His finger hovered over the trackpad, trembling. Part of him wanted to close the laptop, walk away, pretend he'd never seen it. But the other part, the part that had built an empire on information and leverage, needed to know. The folder opened like a door to hell. Spreadsheets. Property records. Financial statements. Tenant agreements. All bearing the same letterhead: ER Estates. All signed with the same elegant signature: Elizabeth Riley, CEO. Clifton scrolled through files with growing horror, each document another nail in the coffin of his delusions. Purchase agreements dating back 12 years. Architectural plans bearing her personal notes. Board meeting minutes where she discussed maximizing the investment potential of Manhattan's luxury residential market. His wife, his quiet, predictable wife, owned the most exclusive building in the city. Had owned it longer than he'd known Vera existed. The room spun. Clifton gripped the desk to steady himself, his vision blurring with the magnitude of his miscalculation. How had he missed this? How had 15 years of marriage failed to reveal that Elizabeth Riley wasn't just old money? She was smart money, working money, the kind of money that bought and sold men like him for sport. He clicked deeper into the files, his morbid curiosity overriding his growing panic. There was a subfolder labeled Current Tenants, and within it, individual profiles for each resident. Doctors, CEOs, foreign diplomats, the kind of people who paid $50,000 a month for privacy and prestige. And there, third from the top, Unit 38A, Clifton Riley, CR Holdings LLC. The file was extensive. Financial verification. Background checks. Even a photograph, his corporate headshot from the Riley Capital website. But it was the additional notes that made his chest tight with terror. Tenant history. Extensive financial background. Married to property owner. Special handling required. Occupant. Vera, Germany. Age 28. Employment. Junior analyst, Riley Capital Management. Additional notes. Personal interest of tenant. Monitor closely. She knew. Elizabeth knew everything. About Vera, about the Penthouse, about every lie he'd told and every boundary he'd crossed. She'd known from the beginning, and she'd let him dig his own grave one shovelful at a time. Clifton's hands shook as he scrolled through more files, each one another layer of evidence that his wife had been playing a game he'd never even realized existed. Security footage timestamps, credit card records, even copies of the flower receipts from yesterday's jewelry shopping spree. She'd been watching. Elizabeth had been watching it all unfold with the patience of a spider waiting for flies. Footsteps in the hallway. Clifton's blood turned to ice. Soft, measured steps on the hardwood floors, Elizabeth's distinctive gait, unhurried and purposeful. He fumbled with the laptop, closing folders and minimizing windows, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird. The footsteps stopped outside the study door. Clifton managed to close the laptop just as the door opened, revealing Elizabeth in a silk robe the color of winter morning. Her dark hair was loose around her shoulders, and she looked exactly like what she was supposed to be, a beautiful woman checking on her husband's late-night work habits. "Working late again?" she asked, her voice carrying the same gentle concern it had held for 15 years. Clifton forced his features into something resembling normalcy, though sweat was beating at his temples. "Just checking emails. You know how it is. Singapore never sleeps." Elizabeth stepped into the room, her bare feet silent on the Persian rug. She moved with fluid grace, like a dancer or a predator, and Clifton couldn't tell which anymore. "I couldn't sleep either," she said, settling into the chair across from the desk. "Strange dreams." "About what?" Her smile was winter-thin, beautiful and deadly. "Architecture. Buildings. Foundations." Her eyes found his, holding them with the kind of steady gaze that made lesser men confess their sins. Funny how quickly the strongest structures can crumble when the foundation shifts. Clifton's mouth went dry. "Elizabeth." "Be careful what you open, darling," she said softly, rising from the chair with the same fluid grace she'd used to enter. "Some doors can't be closed again." She moved toward the door, pausing at the threshold to look back at him. In the dim light, her expression was unreadable, but something in her eyes made Clifton feel like prey that had just realized it was being hunted. "Good night, Clifton. Sweet dreams." The door closed with a soft click, leaving him alone in the darkness with the laptop that contained the evidence of his complete and utter destruction. He sat there for a long time, listening to the house settle around him, understanding finally that he'd been living in someone else's kingdom all along. And the Queen was done pretending to be powerless. Clifton hadn't slept. He'd spent the hours between Elizabeth's midnight visit and dawn pacing his study like a caged animal, his mind racing through scenarios, contingencies, damage control strategies that all led to the same inevitable conclusion. He was fucked. By morning, desperation had crystallized into action. He would go to the Palisade, collect Vera, destroy any evidence of their presence, and disappear until he could figure out how to salvage his life. Maybe Elizabeth didn't know everything. Maybe there was still time to contain the damage. These were the lies desperate men told themselves when the walls began closing in. The Bentley's engine purred as he navigated Manhattan traffic, but the sound that usually soothed him now felt like a funeral dirge. His hands were steady on the wheel. Years of high-stakes negotiations had taught him to project calm even when his world was imploding, but sweat gathered at his collar despite the October chill. The Palisade estate rose before him like a glass monument to his own stupidity. How had he missed it? How had 15 years of marriage failed to reveal that his quiet, predictable wife owned the crown jewel of Manhattan real estate? The elevator ride to the 38th floor felt like ascending to his own execution. Vera was waiting on the terrace, radiant in a wine-red dress that hugged every curve and made her look like sin wrapped in designer silk. The afternoon sun caught her honey-blonde hair, and for a moment, Clifton remembered why he'd risked everything for her. She was youth, passion, the intoxicating promise of a life without obligations or consequences. "Darling." She moved into his arms with fluid grace, her lips finding his with the kind of hunger that had made him forget he was married. "I ordered champagne to celebrate us. The Dom Perignon you love." The crystal flutes caught the light like prisms, casting rainbow fragments across the marble terrace. It should have been perfect, the beautiful woman, the expensive champagne, the city sprawling beneath them like a conquered territory. Instead, it felt like the last meal before an execution. "Vera, we need to talk," Clifton began, his voice tight with tension he couldn't quite hide. "About this place, about us." The elevator chimed. The sound cut through the afternoon air like a blade, soft and civilized and absolutely final. Clifton's blood turned to ice as the brass doors slid open with mechanical precision. Elizabeth Riley stepped out. She moved with the fluid grace of a queen entering her throne room, her white Chanel suit immaculate, her dark hair swept into a chignon that could have been carved from marble. She wasn't alone. Behind her stood a distinguished man in charcoal gray, her legal advisor, Clifton realized with growing horror, and the building's head of security, a former military man whose presence suggested this wasn't a social call. The terrace fell silent except for the distant hum of traffic 40 floors below. Vera's champagne flute trembled in her hand, her eyes wide with confusion as she tried to process the tableau unfolding before her. Elizabeth's gaze swept the scene with clinical detachment. The champagne, the intimate seating arrangement, the woman in red who was young enough to be her daughter. Her expression revealed nothing, but something in her stillness made the air itself seem to freeze. "Elizabeth," Clifton stammered, stepping back instinctively, his carefully cultivated confidence cracking like ice under pressure. "What are you doing here?" "Inspecting my property," she replied, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made billion-dollar deals bend to her will. "And evicting my tenant." The words hit Clifton like physical blows. The terrace tilted, and he gripped the marble railing to steady himself, watching his perfectly constructed lies crumble in real time. "Your property," Vera whispered, her champagne flute slipping from nerveless fingers to shatter against the marble. The sound was sharp, final, like the breaking of something that could never be repaired. Elizabeth turned her attention to the younger woman, her gaze neither cruel nor kind, simply measuring like a scientist examining a specimen under glass. "Miss Germany, I presume." Her voice was silk over steel. "I trust you've been enjoying the accommodations." Vera looked between Elizabeth and Clifton, understanding beginning to dawn in her whiskey-colored eyes. "I don't. Who are you?" "Elizabeth Riley," she said simply. "CEO of ER Estates. Owner of this building." Her smile was winter-thin. "And Clifton's wife." The color drained from Vera's face like water from a broken dam. She stumbled backward, her hand flying to her throat as if she couldn't breathe. Elizabeth's attention returned to Clifton, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 15 years of marriage, 15 years of carefully orchestrated lies, 15 years of being underestimated by the man who'd promised to love and honor her. "You rented your mistress my penthouse, Clifton." Each word was precisely placed, like a surgeon making careful incisions. "Under my company. Using my money. In my building." Clifton opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. His throat had closed, his lungs refusing to function. The magnitude of his miscalculation was crushing him, pressing down on his chest like a physical weight. "I had the accounts audited," Elizabeth continued, her voice never rising above conversational level. "$45,000 monthly, charged to your corporate card, which draws from our joint assets. Technically, I've been funding your affair." Vera gasped, a sound like a wounded animal. She turned to Clifton, her eyes wide with betrayal and dawning horror. "You told me you were divorced. You said—" "He said many things," Elizabeth interrupted gently. "Most of them lies." The security guard stepped forward, his presence a silent reminder that this wasn't a negotiation. Elizabeth reached into her purse and withdrew a single sheet of paper, placing it on the wrought iron table between the shattered champagne glass and the wilting roses. "Eviction notice," she said simply. "Effective immediately. Breach of lease terms. Specifically the clause prohibiting fraudulent representation of identity and unauthorized subleasing." Clifton stared at the document, the legal language blurring before his eyes. "Elizabeth, please. We can discuss this. Work something out. Can we?" Her eyebrows lifted slightly, the only indication of emotion she'd shown since stepping off the elevator. "The way we discussed your business trips to Singapore? The way we worked out your late nights at the office?" She moved closer, close enough that he could smell her perfume, The same Chanel No. 5 she'd worn on their wedding day, the same scent that had filled their bedroom for 15 years. "You chose the wrong building, darling," she whispered, her voice soft enough that only he could hear. "You walked into my kingdom and thought you owned it." The afternoon sun slanted lower, casting long shadows across the terrace. In the distance, Manhattan hummed with life, but here, 40 floors above the city, the only sound was Vera's ragged breathing and the steady thrum of Clifton's heart as it hammered against his ribs. Elizabeth straightened, smoothing her suit with the same calm efficiency she brought to everything else. "You have 1 hour to collect your belongings," she said. "Both of you." The Queen had spoken. The kingdom was reclaimed. And Clifton Riley, master of the universe, finally understood what it meant to be powerless. Elizabeth didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't even raise her voice above the conversational tone she might use to discuss the weather or weekend plans. Instead, she simply stood there in her pristine white suit, 40 floors above the city, and methodically dismantled a man's entire existence. "The consequences," she said, her voice carrying the same quiet authority that had negotiated billion-dollar deals, "are quite straightforward." Clifton watched her with growing horror, his face pale as winter morning, sweat beading at his temples despite the October chill. Vera had retreated to the far corner of the terrace, her wine-red dress a splash of color against the glass railing, her eyes wide with the kind of shock that comes from watching someone's life implode in real time. Elizabeth reached into her purse and withdrew her phone, her movements precise and unhurried. "First, all joint accounts frozen as of this morning. Our personal banking, the investment portfolios, the discretionary funds you've been using to finance your extracurricular activities." She touched the screen with one manicured finger. "Second, your corporate access has been revoked. Riley Capital Management's board received a detailed report an hour ago regarding misappropriation of company resources and violations of the morality clause in your partnership agreement." Clifton's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. "You can't, the board won't." "The board already has," Elizabeth interrupted smoothly. "Unanimous vote. Your partnership is dissolved, your equity redistributed among the remaining partners. Effective immediately." She glanced at Vera, who had gone ashen, her hands gripping the railing as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. "Miss Germany, I believe congratulations are in order. Your modeling contract, the one sponsored by Meridian Public Relations, one of my subsidiary companies, has been terminated. Your portfolio shoots, your Fashion Week bookings, your upcoming campaigns for European luxury brands." Elizabeth's smile was glacier thin. "All cancelled, I'm afraid." Vera made a sound like a wounded animal, her career evaporating before her eyes. The modeling world was small, vicious, and unforgiving. A scandal like this would follow her forever. Elizabeth moved to the wrought iron table where the shattered champagne glass caught the afternoon light like broken dreams. She placed a leather folder beside the crystal fragments, its presence somehow more ominous than any weapon. "And finally," she said, opening the folder with surgical precision, "dissolution of marriage. Adultery, fraud, misappropriation of marital assets, and gross misconduct." She gestured to the documents with the same casual elegance she might use to indicate a wine selection. "I've included photographs, financial records, security footage, and signed statements from building staff. Quite thorough, really." Clifton stared at the papers, his signature line waiting like an open grave. "Elizabeth, please. We can work this out. Counseling, mediation." "You said this penthouse was yours," she interrupted, her voice soft as silk and sharp as surgical steel. "You were right, it is. Every inch of it. Every breath of air, every beam of sunlight, every thread in those Egyptian cotton sheets you've been soiling." She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes, close enough to smell the Chanel No. 5 that had once meant comfort and home. "You just forgot that I owned it first." Elizabeth turned to the security guard, who had been standing at silent attention throughout the confrontation. "Escort Mr. Riley off my property. He's trespassing." The man stepped forward, his presence a physical reminder that Clifton's world had rules now, boundaries he couldn't cross. "Sir, if you'll come with me." "Elizabeth, wait." Clifton reached for her, but she stepped back with fluid grace, placing herself beyond his reach. "Your personal effects will be packed and delivered to whatever address you provide," she said, her tone suggesting she was discussing the disposal of unwanted furniture. "The Hamptons house is off limits, as is the Manhattan penthouse. Both are marital assets under litigation." Clifton looked around the terrace one last time, at the city that had once bowed to his will, at the woman who had made him feel invincible, at the wife who had just reminded him what real power looked like. Vera wouldn't meet his eyes. She stood pressed against the glass railing, her beautiful face streaked with tears, her career in ruins, her future uncertain. When she finally looked at him, it was with the kind of disgust usually reserved for something found on the bottom of a shoe. "I trusted you," she whispered. "I thought you loved me." I do. You destroyed both of us." The security guard's hand settled on Clifton's shoulder, gentle but implacable. "Sir." The elevator doors closed behind him with mechanical finality, leaving Elizabeth and Vera alone on the terrace with the shattered glass and the dying roses and the silence that followed the destruction of lies. As the elevator descended, Clifton watched the floor numbers blur past and realized he was falling. Not just 40 stories, but through the elaborate fiction he'd built around his life, through the delusion that he was untouchable, through the arrogance that had convinced him he could own anything he wanted. The lobby doors opened onto a world where he was no longer Clifton Riley, venture capitalist and master of the universe. He was just another middle-aged man who'd lost everything to his own stupidity, walking alone into a city that no longer recognized his name. 6 weeks later, Clifton Riley sat in a studio apartment above a Korean restaurant in Queens, staring through a grimy window at an alley that smelled of garbage and broken dreams. The space was 800 square feet of industrial carpet and water-stained walls, a universe away from the Park Avenue penthouse he'd called home for 15 years. The news had spread through Manhattan's financial district like wildfire. Riley Investments dissolves amid scandal. Elizabeth Riley named sole CEO of expanded Riley Group. Modeling sensation Vera Germany exits industry following affair exposure. His phone sat silent on the folding table that served as his desk. No calls from former colleagues, no business opportunities, no invitations to charity galas or museum openings. In 6 weeks, Clifton had become a ghost haunting his own life. The settlement had been swift and merciless. Elizabeth's lawyers, a squadron of legal assassins from the city's most prestigious firm, had dismantled 20 years of accumulated wealth with surgical precision. The prenup he'd forgotten existed had protected her family money while leaving his assets vulnerable to division. She'd kept the houses, the art collection, the investment portfolios. He'd kept his clothes and the Aston Martin, which he'd been forced to sell to pay for the Queen's apartment. On a Tuesday evening that felt like the end of the world, he picked up his phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. "You've reached Elizabeth Riley. Please leave a message." Her voice was the same, cultured, controlled, giving nothing away. For a moment, he couldn't speak, couldn't force words through the tightness in his throat. "Liz," he finally managed, her old nickname feeling strange on his tongue. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this. I never meant to hurt." He stopped mid-sentence, realizing the futility of it all. Nothing he said would matter. No apology would resurrect the trust he'd shattered. No explanation would justify the betrayal he'd orchestrated in her own building. He ended the call and stared at his reflection in the dirty window, a stranger's face looking back at him, hollow-eyed and gray, the kind of man who inspired pity rather than respect. Outside, Manhattan glittered like a crown, its lights reflecting off glass towers that reached toward the stars. Somewhere in that constellation of power and wealth, Elizabeth was probably working late in her corner office, building the empire he'd been too arrogant to recognize she'd already owned. The Palisade estate rose among the other buildings like a monument to his own stupidity, its windows catching the city lights and throwing them back in brilliant sheets of gold and silver. He'd thought he was renting paradise. Instead, he'd paid for the privilege of watching his own destruction. Clifton closed his eyes and tried to remember what it had felt like to be king of the world. But all he could see was Elizabeth in her white suit, standing on the terrace like an avenging angel, reminding him that some kingdoms belonged to queens. The city that had once listened to his voice now sang for someone else. And Clifton Riley, former master of the universe, sat alone in the darkness, finally understanding the price of underestimating the woman he'd left behind. At the pinnacle of the Palisade estate, Elizabeth Riley stood before floor-to-ceiling windows that framed Manhattan like a living photograph. The city sprawled beneath her in geometric perfection, each building a piece in an empire she'd spent 20 years quietly building while her husband played his little games below. The conference room was filled with Manhattan's power elite. Investment bankers, real estate moguls, city planners, and journalists whose cameras had been flashing all afternoon. Today marked the official announcement of the Meridian Project, a $12 billion expansion that would reshape the skyline and cement Elizabeth's position as the most influential real estate developer on the East Coast. She wore white again, not the surgical precision of confrontation, but the flowing elegance of victory. Her Chanel suit caught the afternoon light streaming through the windows, making her look like something carved from ivory and ambition. At 41, Elizabeth Riley had never been more beautiful, more powerful, or more completely in control of her destiny. The contracts lay spread across the mahogany table like battle plans. Acquisition agreements for 6 city blocks, architectural renderings of towers that would pierce the clouds, financial projections that made grown men weep with envy. Her signature was already drying on documents worth more than some countries' GDP. Mrs. Riley, called out a journalist from Architectural Digest, her camera ready. The Meridian Project represents the largest private real estate development in Manhattan's history. What drove you to take on something this ambitious? Elizabeth's smile was winter sunlight, bright, beautiful, and utterly cold. Vision, she said simply. The ability to see potential where others see problems. To build something lasting from. She paused, her gaze drifting momentarily toward the window. Questionable foundations. Another reporter leaned forward. There have been rumors about personal changes in your life affecting your business approach. Care to comment? For a moment, something flickered behind Elizabeth's composed mask. Not pain, but the memory of pain, transformed into something harder and infinitely more valuable. Real estate taught me something fundamental, she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had negotiated billion-dollar deals. You can build over ruins, if the foundation is strong enough. The room fell silent except for the whisper of camera shutters capturing history in the making. Elizabeth moved to the window, her reflection ghosting over the city below like a queen surveying her domain. The strongest structures aren't built on solid ground, she continued, her words precisely placed like architectural elements. They're built on the bones of what came before. Every foundation tells a story of what was demolished to make room for something better. Flashbulbs exploded like stars, immortalizing the moment when Elizabeth Riley claimed her place among the titans who shaped cities and bent skylines to their will. She was no longer the quiet wife arranging charity events and managing social calendars. She was the woman who owned the air above Manhattan, who decided which dreams became skyscrapers and which ambitions crumbled into dust. The Meridian Project, she said, turning back to face the room, will stand for the next century as a testament to what's possible when you stop underestimating the quiet ones. The applause was thunderous, but Elizabeth barely heard it. Her attention had drifted to the terrace beyond the glass doors, the same terrace where she'd confronted her husband's betrayal, where she'd reclaimed her kingdom one devastating revelation at a time. Far below, 47 floors down on the sidewalk that had once felt like his personal red carpet, Clifton Riley walked with the careful gait of a man trying to avoid recognition. His off-the-rack suit hung loose on a frame that had lost 20 pounds, and his once perfect hair showed gray at the temples that expensive stylists no longer touched up. He shouldn't have come here. Queens was safer, anonymous, a place where former masters of the universe could fade into the background noise of ordinary lives. But something had drawn him back to Midtown, to the glass cathedral that had been the scene of his greatest triumph and most spectacular downfall. The Palisade estate rose above him like a monument to his own stupidity, its facade reflecting the afternoon sun in sheets of gold and amber. Tourists gathered on the sidewalk, pointing up at the building where New York's newest real estate queen held court. "That's where Elizabeth Riley works," one of them said, her voice carrying the awe reserved for modern mythology. "They say she's the most powerful woman in Manhattan real estate." Clifton tilted his head back, following their gaze to the pinnacle of the tower where he could just make out figures moving behind the glass. Somewhere up there, in air that once carried his lies and promises, Elizabeth was reshaping the world while he shuffled along the sidewalk like a ghost haunting his former life. The wind shifted, carrying something that might have been laughter through the canyon of glass and steel. It could have been anyone: construction workers, tourists, children playing in nearby Central Park. But Clifton knew, with the certainty of a man who'd lost everything to his own arrogance, that it was her voice he heard carried on the October breeze. Elizabeth, laughing at something one of her executives had said, or perhaps just at the sheer improbability of it all. How a quiet wife with old money breeding had built an empire while her husband played with toys he'd mistaken for treasures. A taxi honked. The crowd moved. The city flowed around him like water around a stone, and Clifton realized with crystalline clarity that he was no longer part of its current. He was debris washed up on the shore, a relic of his own making. He'd rented his girlfriend a penthouse in the most exclusive building in Manhattan, convinced he was buying paradise with stolen money and borrowed time. He'd never realized his wife owned the entire skyline. As the sun set behind the glass towers, casting long shadows across the city that no longer knew his name, Clifton Riley disappeared into the crowd, another middle-aged man with a story no one wanted to hear, walking alone through a kingdom that had never been his to rule. High above, Elizabeth's laughter echoed through corridors of power, and the city sang her name.